So I first became interested in forestry in general and silviculture in particular at the very beginning of my natural resources career when I worked on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska. And at the time I was working in a forest that was recently affected by a large spruce bark beetle outbreak, and I was doing a lot of different natural resource oriented things in the forest, including logging. And I wouldn't have known to call it this at the time, but that is silviculture, is really managing forests for desired conditions. Much of my current work is focused on tree regeneration in western U.S. conifer stands. Uncertainties involving tree regeneration emerge when we do things differently than we have in the past, which is the case with some of our newest restoration treatments, or when we're doing the same thing we've always done and when the world changes around us. The obvious example there is climate change. So both these situations have created uncertainties with respect to tree regeneration, and my research is oriented toward those issues. I would say all of the most rewarding moments of my career have involved students and mentoring. And I don't know if I could really narrow that down to a single moment, but anytime a student comes up to me after class and articulates that something I've said or presented to them has really changed the way they view the world, it's been a really rewarding experience for me.
Thank you for coming to the first installment of our department seminar series this semester. My name is Edward Hill. I'm a second-year master's student in forest sciences. I study tree regeneration ecology under Dr. Seth Ex, who's our presenter today. Seth is an assistant professor of silviculture in our department. He's been in that position since 2014. His research covers a broad range of topics in forest ecology, from basic science investigations to projects which emphasize the applied nature of forest ecology, specifically longevity and effects of silvicultural treatments on tree regeneration and forest fuels. Today, Seth is going to talk to us about tree regeneration as it pertains to silvicultural practices in the western United States, and the importance of those topics in the context of managing for environmental uncertainty. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Seth Ex.
Thanks, Ed. That was great. Do you want to give my talk? Better than me. Okay, so I'd like to talk to you a little bit about tree regeneration and some of the things that we have going on in the silviculture lab that pertain to tree regeneration for a little while. Some of this is Ed's work, so he'll rear up again later. So here's where we're going today. I'd like to start by sort of coming to terms with you on how the world looks from my discipline. So we'll start by talking a little bit about silviculture and the silvicultural perspective, specifically as it pertains to tree regeneration. We'll then move into some knowledge gaps that we've identified related to tree regeneration and some of the projects that my lab has got going to address those knowledge gaps. So that's the structure of the talk. Let's dive right in. Let's talk about silviculture. And when we talk about silviculture, well, let's start with what silviculture is. What is silviculture? Anybody know? There's some silviculturists out there, I know.
Cultivation of forests.
Cultivation of forests. Yeah, or straight to the Latin. Yeah, cultivation of forests. Agriculture is the cultivation of fields. Silviculture is the cultivation of forests. That's one of my go-to definitions. I agree. Any other working definitions? I like applied forest ecology too. I think that works pretty well. So yeah, I would call both of those things accurate. Cultivation of forest, applied forest ecology. Silviculture is intervening in forest ecology to move stands toward a desired condition. So that we have this thing that we're pretty interested in. We call it desired future condition, abbreviated DFC. Here we'll talk about it a little bit over a few slides. So DFC is desired future condition. Historically, our desired future conditions in silviculture have been they dealt with timber and wood. That's really the roots of the discipline. There's strong roots there. Nowadays, it's rare to find a silvicultural project that's strictly oriented on timber. Multiple objectives are the norm now. So we're almost always managing for multiple objectives. Timber may be one of those objectives. It may still be the most important objective, but it's not going to be just timber anymore. So the elements of our desired future condition would be defined in silviculture as structure and composition of a forest stand. So structure being the number of trees in a stand and their size. So the physical structure of a stand. Composition usually refers to the species mix of trees in a stand. And then something that is a little unusual to have on this list is time. And I'm going to elaborate on that in a moment. The key thing to take away here is that we're going to design or define our desired future condition in terms of structure and composition of a stand. So structure and composition change over time due to stand dynamics. That's why time is on that list and why it's important as well. We can create structures and compositions in stand, but they're ephemeral. Stands are dynamic entities. Forests change over time, and so any set of structure and compositions will change over time. What causes a structure and composition to change over time? That's stand dynamics, and stand dynamics are disturbance. So trees have to die for things to change in a stand, so it's going to be disturbance or the lack thereof. That could be anything from individual trees dying from endemic pests or pathogens in a stand to big disturbance events like a stand replacing fire. Regeneration after growing space is vacated by disturbance, which is where we're mostly going to focus today, is on tree regeneration, and then tree growth. The differential growth rates of trees in a stand, species of trees, size classes of trees, canopy classes of trees. Because we define our objectives in terms of desired future conditions, because desired future conditions are fundamentally wrapped up in stand dynamics, they change over time, we have to deal with regeneration to effectively deal with the desired future conditions. So it's really central to what we do in silviculture. I think most silviculturists would agree that regeneration is central to the mission of the discipline. So we have some well-developed methods to deal with regeneration in silviculture. There's a few things we can do to explicitly manage regeneration. We have methods to promote and inhibit natural regeneration. So these would be silvicultural regeneration methods. They'd have some names that'd be familiar to many people in here: clear cut, shelterwood, simple coppice. These are all methods of regenerating stands by creating conditions in a stand that are conducive to regeneration of a desired species, and that will result in the desired structure eventually over time as the trees that are regenerating grow. If we tend to gravitate towards natural regeneration as the default, right? Natural regeneration is often preferred. If for no other reason, then it tends to be less costly than artificial regeneration. So we usually look for natural regeneration. When we can't realize our objectives through natural regeneration, we may pursue artificial regeneration. And artificial regeneration in silviculture is going to refer to planting seedlings. Typically, seedlings would be grown in the nursery for a year or two and then outplanted. That's something like that. Or sowing seeds directly. So putting seeds out there and letting those seeds germinate and turn into trees. That's less common in this region. Planting is more the norm, but sowing is not unheard of. Either of these activities may be prepared or paired with other treatments that would enhance those activities. So examples of that might be site preparation treatments, things like burning or disking or ripping in a stand. So these would be the things that disturb the soil surface in order to create a better seed bed for natural regeneration, for example. Or things like early competition control, like weeding a stand, or application of herbicide to improve the growing environment for regenerating seedlings. Silviculturists would prescribe these treatments as part of a prescription based on their silvicultural knowledge and experience. So based on the silvics of the tree species they're dealing with and the conditions of the site, they would draw upon their experience and the experience of others through the body of silvicultural knowledge to prescribe appropriate treatments. So it's fair to ask where that comes from, that body of silvicultural knowledge. Practitioner experience is quite important in this discipline. We said at the outset that it's related to agriculture, right? Agriculture is the cultivation of fields. Silviculture is the cultivation of forage. There's an element of art in this, and so we draw pretty heavily on practitioner experience in silviculture. And I'm speaking specifically of informal studies here. This can be really, really great. Really wonderful things can happen from practitioner experience. It can be lacking at times. Informal studies can be misinterpreted. They can be applied beyond their reasonable scope of inference, that kind of thing. People sometimes are just wrong, right? They're just wrong-headed. That happens all the time. But practitioner experience is quite important. My lab tends to deal in these second two bullets formal experiments, and then observational studies. So there's strengths and weaknesses of both of these approaches. Experiments have a long history in silviculture. The gold standard in my discipline is long-term experiments. That's where growth and yield research comes from, right? We establish stands, or we do a set of treatments, and then we sit back and watch for decades, and to see what happens. And that's a wonderful way to understand what happens. That is appropriately a gold standard. This picture is a long line of silviculturists walking to see a long-term experiment. It's like a pilgrimage. That's a big, good, important source of information for us is experiments. Something that gets a separate bullet. It's kind of worthy of addressing on its own. A certain flavor of experiment that's become recognized as being particularly powerful is adaptive management, which is a way of formally experimenting within the management context itself, where you're prescribing treatments in such a way that you can compare the results of alternative treatments and iteratively change your operations, what you're doing over time in a robust, scientifically grounded way. One of the standard bearers for adaptive management's back here, Linda Nagel. So experimental designs have the strength of allowing you to get at causation. You can make very strong inference from experiments. They have the weakness of not always being available when you need them. There isn't a great experiment for every problem out there, and it may be difficult to apply outside of their original context, so they can be kind of narrow. Observational studies have strengths and weaknesses as well, and they tend to complement experimental approaches, right? So observational studies you don't have a strong inference. You can't really get at causality with observational studies, but they can be very helpful for describing conditions. We want to know what's out there. We want to know what the standing volume is across a forest. We want to know what the effect of a treatment that we've been implementing over decades has been over time, and we haven't looked at it yet. We can go back and do some retrospective work. We can learn that way. They can be very, very informative. They're often just more practical than designed experiments. So we use both of these in my lab. Experiments and observational studies, we use them in a complementary sort of way. We try to draw from the strengths and weaknesses of both of them. Finally, we do some modeling too. I'm not going to talk really that much about that today, but that's an important piece of silvicultural knowledge. Our modeling tends to be empirical predictive models, where we use descriptive statistics to characterize the world, and then draw on the parameters of those relationships to predict what the outcomes of our treatments will be. Okay, so that's where knowledge comes from. Let's talk about where knowledge gaps come from. And I'm just, for the sake of the talk, I'm going to break this into a couple different categories. There's a couple ways in which knowledge gaps sort of bubble up in the realm of silviculture and regeneration work in particular. One way that we can generate knowledge gaps is by doing something differently than we have in the past. We just don't have that much to draw on when we start doing new things. We don't have a lot of examples to look at of where people have done it before. It's maybe different enough that we don't have great experimental work to draw on. This is an example of doing something new. This is a restoration treatment. This is Wade Tinkham and Ed Hill. They're contemplating this knowledge gap. They're saying, what's going to happen here? We don't know. And we'll talk about that shortly. Another way in which knowledge gaps can arise is, we're doing what we've always done, but conditions have changed around us, right? So that can be climate change is the obvious thing there. We've got a program for regenerating trees on this forest. It's worked great for a long time. It's just getting hotter and drier and hotter and drier, and that might not work forever. So things are changing around us. So from here on, we're going to talk about a few knowledge gaps. We're just going to pick a few and talk about the projects that we've developed to address those knowledge gaps. So, and they're all going to be cast as this something new or changing conditions. So our first thing we'll talk about that's kind of new, it's new-ish, hazardous fuels reduction treatments. We've done a bunch of work on hazardous fuels reduction treatments. And the knowledge gap that we've identified there, well, first let's just come to terms on that. Hazardous fuels reduction treatments. Typically this involves thinning trees and reducing surface fuels for the purposes of reducing potential fire behavior in stands. The DFC, the desired future condition, is we would like that stand to be resistant to fire. Typically at a stand level resistance is what we're focused at. The structure we're looking for, large, low-density trees. There's a lot of space between trees. They're big. The crowns are way off the ground. The composition would be fire-tolerant species, things like ponderosa pine, like in our native forest here. Something that's kind of unique about fuels reduction treatments relative to other silvicultural treatments is that the desired future condition is achieved sometimes immediately after treatment. So we're implementing a fuels treatment. We're able to reduce the surface fuels immediately, reduce the density of the overstory stand immediately, and then it deteriorates over time as those fuels and vegetation grow back, which is kind of backwards from most of the other stuff in silviculture. For most of the things we do something now in pursuit of a desired condition that happens on the next person's watch. So when we don't thin a stand, if we're thinning in pursuit of timber, we don't thin a stand now because we want a stand with less standing volume in it. We thin a stand now because we want a stand with bigger trees in it in 20 years. You know, so it's this idea that we get what we want right away in these fuels treatments. And I think that's part of the reason why we have a knowledge gap here. So the knowledge gap is what's going on with tree regeneration following fuels treatments, right? So fuel reaccumulates in these stands, or hazardous conditions reestablish in these stands over time because new trees establish and grow, because existing trees grow, because fuel accumulates. That sort of stuff happens. So we have to be able to address this question of how trees regenerate in these treatments to understand how the desired condition that we're creating immediately after treatment deteriorates over time. The reason why I think this is a gap, even though we've been doing fuels treatments for a while, is, well, a while is relative. They're kind of new relative to a lot of the other silvicultural treatments that we perform. And it's the backwards piece that I think is probably more important. It's because when we do fuels treatments, we just get what we're looking for right away and we can kind of walk away. And it's pretty easy to ignore the trajectory of stand development afterwards because you've achieved your desired condition right away. In fact, a more honest characterization of the desired condition would probably account for that trajectory over time. So, how do we approach this? We approach this observationally. So this is we'll talk about a series of studies that have happened over a couple of years here. They started out with a, they started out with a pilot study. So the main idea here is that there's a lot of fuels treatments on the Front Range now. Let's go see what's in them. Let's go see what's happened in terms of tree regeneration, and let's assess the effect of a couple variables that we think are probably important in terms of driving the amount and the composition of tree regeneration that we're getting in fuels treatments. How good the site is, and so in silviculture, good usually means productive. So how productive the site is, and we're using aspect as a stand-in for that here. Northerly aspects tend to be more productive in this part of the world, and then treatment type. So what exactly we did as something that might drive regeneration. We started with a relatively small study in the vicinity of Fort Collins. We sampled a couple dozen treated and untreated stands in the vicinity of Red Feather Lakes. Stratified these by aspect and then treatment. So northerly stands, southerly stands, so higher productivity, lower productivity, and then stands that were thinned with and without follow-up prescribed fire. So that was the treatment difference, was with and without follow-up prescribed fire. And we used a chronosequence approach. So we intentionally went out and we found stands that had just been treated, and we found stands that were treated a few years ago, and we found stands that were treated a few years before that, and so on and so forth. So we used a chronosequence approach to try to get at the progression or the accumulation of regeneration in these stands over time. This is a McIntyre Stennis funded project. It was David Francis's master's project, for those of you who were around. These were all dry mix conifer stands dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. Consisted of a lot of inventory work. So a lot of plots and a couple dozen stands. We did collect a limited sample of seedling ages or juvenile ages, but not a great one. And that came back and bit us. So what did we find? And for all of these, we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty. No p-values. Ponderosa pine increased after treatment. So we look at all these stands, and one thing that was obvious was that after you put fuels treatments out there, you establish these low density conditions with a lot of ponderosa pine in the overstory, you get ponderosa pine. It shows up. It didn't matter whether stands were burned, which kind of surprised us. We didn't see any effective fire in there. And we didn't have an effective aspect per se, But for all practical purposes, these things are going to last longer on southern aspects than on northern aspects, because the northern aspects was where all the Douglas fir was, and there was a lot of Douglas fir in there, Douglas fir advanced regeneration. So if you're unfamiliar with the ecology of our local species, ponderosa pine, early seral fire adapted, Douglas fir later seral less fire adapted. So the treatments were favoring ponderosa pine, but there was just a lot of Douglas fir in there. A lot of it was there before treatment. That was something that our limited sample of juvenile ages was able to tell us, was that there was a lot of advanced regeneration. A lot of those trees were there prior to the treatment, the juvenile trees. We couldn't really say much more than that, but we could say that there was a lot of advanced regeneration. So one thing that we did, so we carried this work on and spread it out over a larger landscape. We felt like we worked through our methods in the first project, and we aged all the juvenile trees because we realized that was really got in our way the first time around. We moved the project south into a bigger area, so now we have, instead of a couple dozen stands with grids of plots in them, we went to a plot level approach, and we spread a couple hundred plots out across a pretty big landscape from down by Sedalia here all the way up through Conifer and up into the Boulder area. This was Katie Fialco's thesis work. Some of you have probably seen some of this. This was integrated into a Colorado Forest Restoration Institute monitoring project. So it had some funding from McIntyre Stennis, it had some funding from the United States Forest Service and from Denver Water as a result of how it was integrated with monitoring. We stratified in this project by aspect again and treatment again, so again north-south. The treatments were a little different. In this case it was thinned and masticated. There just wasn't enough fire down here to sample that again. We just didn't have enough examples of that. So we went with thinned and masticated for this one. Still a dry mix conifer forest dominated by ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. Again, lots of inventory plot work. This time we cut all the little trees and brought them back and counted the rings. So taking that together, those couple of projects together, there's some things we can say with reasonable confidence here. These treatments are pushing composition towards ponderosa pine. That's clear. So by opening those stands up, making them less dense, and keeping a lot of ponderosa pine in the overstory, we're pushing composition towards ponderosa pine. However, most of the juveniles were Douglas fir, and most were advanced regeneration. So we're, by acting in the stand, by implementing a treatment, we're sort of pushing in the direction of ponderosa pine, but they kind of want to go to Douglas fir, at least on the northern aspects. There's just a lot of advanced regeneration out there, and a lot of it's Douglas fir. In specific, in this study, 60% of the second study, 60% of the juveniles were advanced regeneration. Again, treatment type was not predictive of regeneration abundance. It is, our take on this is there's enough variation within these categories of treatments. Thinning can look a lot of different ways. Mastication can look kind of different. Burning can be pretty different in its effects, that there's just not a clear signal from those treatment types. It wasn't informative for us. So this leads us to some key conclusions. My big one out of this whole project is that, man, fuels treatments are like, this is a piece of silvicultural terminology which will come up later, they're like shelter wood regeneration treatments. That's how we should be thinking about them. They're like a regeneration treatment, and that's not how we think about them as a discipline now. We think about them as something that is targeted at changing the fuels complex, but they're really changing the regeneration environment in an important way, and we should think about them like regeneration treatments, and that would direct our attention to the overstory composition and the species Sylvix that we're dealing with, and that would help us understand how the desired condition will change over time. The second thing that stood out as being really important from this line of work is that we really need to understand what's happening with advanced regeneration if we're going to be leaving it behind, because we are in these treatments. That's out there, and it's critical to understand whether or not it will release. So release meaning whether it will start growing quickly after the overstory density is reduced. If that doesn't happen, if these trees stay this size and kind of just falter over time, it probably is not going to affect the condition that much in terms of potential fire behavior. If these trees take off and start putting on height growth and accumulating biomass fairly quickly, that's an entirely different story. So where are we going with this project? given what I just said. We have ongoing work within the context of working with CFRI and monitoring. We're going to extend the study design that we've nailed down now over 2 projects into a higher elevation forest type that's got a lodgepole pine component that's wetter, and evaluate what's happening there. So we'll have a broader forest cover type gradient to work with. We're currently, when I say we, I specifically mean Katie, are analyzing tree rings from the last sampling effort to identify release. So we realized that's pretty important, and we didn't understand exactly when that's happening, so now we're going back and reanalyzing tree rings and figuring out what proportion of the advanced regeneration we sampled is releasing and what trees those are. And it looks like it's going to be the largest Douglas fir are probably what's really releasing in there. And we've got some parallel work going on that Chad Hoffman and Wade Tinkham and Justin Ziegler are all intimately tangled up with, that involves taking this stand level stuff and trying to understand it at the landscape level through modeling. So using some of the data that we collected in the observational work regarding the abundance of seedlings after these treatments, and using it to populate a model, a couple of models that allows us to grow stands over time using a growth and yield model, and then simulate fire and evaluate the impact of having different amounts of regeneration in different stands. And I'm not even going to try to explain that right now, but it's there. Okay, so that's an example of how we've used primarily observational methods in that first instance to address these knowledge gaps related to tree regeneration in the context of silviculture. The second example is an example of how conditions have changed, and we'd like to address that in terms of regeneration. So it's probably not news to people that it's forecast to get hotter and drier in some places. The map we're looking at is a map of the distribution of Engelmann spruce in southwestern Colorado, and it's been it's not work from my lab. This is work from somebody else's lab. It's up here because it kind of inspired the direction we took here. This is a bioclimate model approach, right? So these different colors reflect projections of changes in the distribution of Engelmann spruce by sometime late in the 21st century. So we're looking here, this big blotch of red is on the Uncompahgre Plateau. There's currently a lot of Engelmann spruce here. It's predicted to be not very suitable. Red's bad. Not very suitable for Engelmann spruce there. The yellow is places where it's kind of marginal. The black are places where it's supposed to be about the same, and the blue are emergent, which is pretty much all alpine. So these are the exercises to take the climate where the species currently exists and compare that to projections of future climate and say, how do we think the distribution might change over time? This doesn't get at any of the mechanisms involved. It's just relating climates, right? So this isn't accounting for what disturbances would cause species to leave one place or seed dispersal into a new place, or there's probably not enough soil up here to support Engelmann spruce where it's blue, right? So it's strictly a climate exercise, or modeling exercise. For silviculture, as a silviculturist, the things that stand out to me when I look at this type of map is well, for this to happen, for something like this to happen, you have to have some disturbance, right? Because you have to have trees leave where they are now. So something's got to die for them to go. So there has to be some disturbance in there, and regeneration has to not happen. Right, so you got to have tree. Where trees are now, they need to die and not come back. And so we're talking about regeneration. We're going to focus on regeneration. And so the knowledge gap that we're going to move to from here is, what can we expect from environmental change in terms of tree regeneration, and specifically we're going to talk about Engelmann spruce. So Engelmann spruce has kind of emerged as a species of interest in southwestern Colorado. It's kind of notoriously difficult to regenerate. It dries out and dies. It doesn't really like heat that much, and so it's on people's radar. So we decided to take a look at that. We took an observational approach here, at least initially as well. The main idea was let's go to stands that were supposed to be regenerating and look at what was happening during a stressful time in terms of weather, right? So let's go find some place that had some stressful weather conditions, or find a time that had some stressful weather conditions, and find stands that should have been regenerating then. Then we'll analyze relationships between the weather variables. So this is just downscaled climate stuff that a lot of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, and what we're seeing in terms of the abundance of regeneration as far as how it's showing up on an annual basis. We're dealing with establishment here. So this is retrospective. We're looking back. All we're looking at this point through the mists of time is what's still there. So it's really establishment. This was Curtis Prolick's master's work. So some of you may remember Curtis. And Ed Hill reanalyzed this data set and published it. It came out online last fall, but I guess it's just come out in print this month. So there's a couple of students involved in this, again funded by McIntyre Stennis. We went and found a couple dozen Engelmann spruce stands that received regeneration treatments prior to this big drought event in the early 2000s. This is the biggest drought event of the last century, one of the biggest of the last 500 years or so, regarded as being a pretty big deal. We went and found stands that had partial overstories of spruce. They had been treated specifically to generate natural spruce regeneration. So they were spruce in the overstory, there was a seed source there, and the conditions were regarded as good. There was some shade on the site, they were supposed to be reasonably cool. They should have been regenerating during this period of time. We did our best, well, let me make the point here. We did not try to sample across the Rayfelt categories, those the red, blue, yellow. We didn't try to capture that gradient. We really focused on finding stands that should have been regenerating, and that narrowed our sample significantly. So know that. We're not trying to get across their gradient. We did try to get across a precipitation gradient, wetness gradient, within the set of stands we found that should have been regenerating at that period of time. We did all right with that. Although everything we sampled ended up being in those like threatened to persistent categories. So the way I would characterize these stands is they're pretty good for Colorado Engelmann spruce. They're not that great, but they're pretty good for Colorado Engelmann spruce. There's definitely worse stands to be had out there. Our sample was distributed pretty evenly across a range of precipitation from just over 500 millimeters to about 9,500 millimeters. Again, all stands had shade on the site, which is regarded to be important for spruce regeneration, and a seed source. So there were a couple surprises. First, I'll make the point. So this analysis, Cameron Aldridge in Wildlife was involved intimately in this analysis, was pretty important for this, so he deserves credit here. So one of the things that stood out, and it stood out from Curtis Prolick's analysis for his master's, it stood out for the second, this reanalysis of this data, and we poked at it a lot in between, and just this was a consistent theme, was that we couldn't detect that drought by looking at regeneration data. The treatments were doing what they were supposed to be doing, in that they were regenerating spruce throughout that period when it was, ostensibly really hostile up there, really dry. The school answer for Engelmann spruce is that it really needs, it dies really easily when it's hot and dry. It's drought and heat that will kill Engelmann spruce as a seedling. I mean, that's kind of the received wisdom on that. And it was more complicated than that here, and here we found that growing season length, so the amount of time a seedling has to accumulate biomass over the growing season, and competition from overstory trees, so light competition, were as or more important in predicting establishment success than variables that would be indexing moisture availability. But moisture availability was also a factor as well. So it was complicated here. There was more than one thing limiting the regeneration of Engelmann spruce in these stands, and that the limitations changed over time. So what was most limiting for the very young seedlings, for things that were less than a couple years old, was spring moisture. So little tiny trees that didn't have much of a root system died if we had years when we didn't have very much moisture in the spring, when the snowpack melted off early. But older seedlings didn't really notice that so much. They were able to weather that. They had more developed root systems probably. Whereas as those trees got older, then the growing season length and the effect of overstory basal area was more important. So we're seeing seeing just some statistics from this paper that kind of support these ideas. The top, we're looking at the y-axis, and all of these are predicted count of seedlings, and the x-axis on the top is 5-year mean frost-free period length, and you can see that there's a sweet spot here where it doesn't invariably do better when it's wet, right? So as you get short growing seasons, you have a lot of failure. You don't have a lot of success. There's a sweet spot when the growing season is 50 days or so, when you have a lot of success, and then as you get longer, it probably gets too dry, and then you'd have less success. In the middle picture, we're looking at summer heat moisture index, which is, you can think of this as dryness, and essentially same thing happens here. There's a sweet spot. If it's too dry, or sorry, if it's too wet, you get nothing. It's probably because it's too cold, and then or there's not enough growing resources available. As you get in, there's a sweet spot as it gets drier where you get a lot of regeneration success, and then as it gets very dry, it tapers off again. And the story for basal area is pretty straightforward. More basal area you get, the fewer seedlings you have. So basal area was the effect of basal area was inhibitive in this stand. So we paired this with some related work. Some of this happened afterwards, some of it was going on at the same time. This was experimental stuff. It was also oriented at environmental controls on spruce regeneration. This stuff was all focused over here on the Uncompahgre Plateau in this big red blotch. Our other studies were over in here in this yellow. So we were on harsher sites here. These are planting and sowing studies where we looked at the amount of overstory shade, the amount of dead shade from, say, logs or stumps right on the ground, and the drought tolerance of planted species as factors that would be predictive of survival here. So we compared Engelmann spruce and ponderosa pine, and we did some sowing of Engelmann spruce alongside some planting of Engelmann spruce in different environments. This was master's thesis work from Ryan Davey. He's my first master's student when I started here. And then Ed Hill's master's project is also here on the plateau. So I'm not going to share much in the way of results from this in the interest of not scooping Ed. I'll put a plug in that he's defending his thesis in March, and will elaborate on the second planting project on the plateau in detail at that point. I will, well, I'll bring one thing up in a minute. So the key conclusions we get from this body of work, where we're using observational and experimental approaches to look at environmental limits to regeneration for tree species and sort of mesic mixed conifer forests. The first is kind of, maybe this is more of a watch out to myself more than anyone else, but it's that, you know, it can be easy to take the received wisdom from the literature as indicative of what's happening in the landscape, but in fact, in this case, that wasn't what was happening. So, you know, we have this expectation that the way to get spruce to regenerate is to not let it get too hot and dry, essentially. And in this case, that would have been counterproductive on the sites in which we were working. So it was more complicated there. And the restrictions on tree regeneration are going to change through juvenile life stages, so that it's not static over time, and it's maybe pretty important to have a good picture of that if you're going to be a good silviculturist, right? Because if your restrictions on regeneration on your site are what's happening in the first couple years of juvenile development, well, maybe you can just plant bigger seedlings and just, you know, leapfrog over that. But if you don't understand like how the restrictions change over time, then you don't have the ability to make those determinations. So that was those were key findings for me. The other one is scooping Ed just a little bit. Dead shade's super important, and that was all the planting stuff we've done so far supports that. The idea that, man, if you stick a seedling next to a stump or a log, 2 thumbs up. That really made a huge difference across the board. It was just more so than anything else we looked at. Sorry, Ed. Okay, one more. So this is something new. This is an example of another knowledge gap that's arisen from, I'm going to call these spatially heterogeneous restoration treatments. I use different terminology. It seems like every time I talk about these, but this seems as inoffensive as anything. These are treatments that are designed, explicitly designed to create spatial structure at scales smaller than a stand. And so a stand scale would be like maybe 10 to 100 acres. Just to ballpark it there. So we're looking at making structure at smaller scales than that. You can see this is an example of a spatially heterogeneous restoration treatment. You can see there's large variation in the density of the overstory trees across this treatment. There's nothing out here, and there's a dense pocket here. These treatments are, these spatial structures are being created with the idea that they have functional attributes that are desirable, specifically in terms of resilience. So these stands are going to perform well in the face of challenges from fire, insects, climate change, that sort of thing. So there's this idea that there's functional attributes associated with these spatial relationships. We're drawing from historical reference conditions to define these relationships, so we think that in the presence of functioning natural disturbance regimes, these structures, or structures that look somewhat like these, would be created and maintained by natural functioning disturbance regimes. That's a key assumption here, right? That's what's going on. So it's a knowledge gap because it's new. We don't have a lot of examples of these to look at yet. They're accumulating, but they're newer than fuels treatments. So there's not that many of them to look at yet. And I struggle with coming up with an example of one that's functioning in a natural disturbance regime. And you could make the argument that there are no natural disturbance regimes that look exactly like the disturbance regimes that created these structures. So they're kind of novel in that way as well. I define the knowledge gap here in this huge word salad, right? In this way that's really hard to understand. So I'm going to take a minute and talk through this because I did that intentionally to make a point. So I call this knowledge gap, what are the environmental limits that define good regeneration microsites, and how are these conditions distributed in space and time? I want to key in on something here. I'm talking about microsites all of a sudden. I shifted. I've been talking about stands and stuff up until now, and all of a sudden I'm talking about a different scale. I'm talking about much smaller areas, and that's because this is so variable. So that's a key thing to think about here. We're working in kind of a new paradigm in that sense. So we're dealing with this small scale variation, and a lot of our silvicultural knowledge base is really cast at the stand scale and expects that variation to disappear into an average somehow. And it doesn't really work when our stands look like this stand does. The problem is in the absence of good examples of these treatments that have been around for a while, and some question about whether or not they're really existing in the disturbance regimes that would maintain them naturally. What's the trajectory? What trajectory of stand development should we expect following these treatments? In order to really get at that, we kind of need to understand what's going on in terms of tree regeneration in all these different environments within the stand. So it leads us into understanding, well, what's good and what's bad in that stand in terms of a regeneration microsite. So how do we define good regeneration microsites? What are the environmental limits that define good regeneration microsites? So at that scale, at that small scale, what's good and what's bad? How do we define that? And then for a given stand, for this stand, how much of this is good and how much of it is bad, and what's good and what's bad, and how does that change over time? And what do we have to work with there? And so we can look at that from a couple different perspectives. We can look at that as, well, we don't really want trees to show up in here right away, and so we don't really want a lot of good because that would undermine us in terms of our desired condition. Or we can look at that in terms of we don't really know what we're going to get in terms of regeneration, or we're worried about not getting regeneration, and we'd like to know what we have to do to get regeneration. So we can bring in some other examples here. We can talk about big disturbances like fire, and the fact that there's more of those than there have been in the past, and there seem like there's going to be more of those, and that it seems like they're not all filling up with trees right away again, and maybe we'd like some of them too. And so we might be faced with the prospect of doing pretty large-scale planting in areas that we're not in pursuit of timber. We're not going to get a payoff from that planting, so it's a stewardship effort, and it'd be really nice to have some efficiencies in that, to know that when we stuck trees in the ground that they were going to be successful. And so it might be nice to be able to characterize individual microsites as far as whether or not they're going to be successful for a specific tree species. We could get even more apocalyptic and talk about, well, maybe we have situations in which we have disturbances where where we're native species, we're not able to reestablish native species. How can we select the right exotic species to reforest a place that we can't reforest with natives? How can we use tree breeding or genetic improvement to make outplanting stock that has traits that will make it more suited to the range of microsites that are available in a particular area? So this is the direction we're heading in this. We're taking a little turn. We're doing this experimentally, and the concept here is, can we make a map of microsites that are defined in terms of the environmental tolerances of juvenile trees? Can we say, this seedling here needs X amount of soil moisture and temperatures that stay in this range during the growing season? I'm going to look out at the stand in front of me. Where can I stick it? What places in this stand meet those criteria? So we need to both define the places, map the places, and define them in terms of those criteria. So we want to be able to map the environmental conditions at about a meter scale. That's easy. We would like to crosswalk those environmental tolerances to or crosswalk those conditions to the environmental tolerances of specific tree species and planting stock. All right. How are we going to do this? Well, experimentally, we're going to install a paired sowing and planting experiment of sympatric conifer species that have different shade and drought tolerances in a heterogeneous stand, and then we're going to continuously monitor physiologically relevant environmental variables in individual microsites. Easy, right? There's some people to call out in here. This is definitely not a solo effort. Jeff Cannon has been intimately involved in this. Wade Tinkham involved in the study design. Troy Ochiltree, we're dealing with physiology here. He's been involved in that. And Ed pops up one more time. He's transitioning into a PhD project shortly, and he's going to take this on. Oh, also, some McIntyre Stennis funding, some NRCS SEEP funding. Our project is being graciously hosted by NRCS Conservation Project, so it's on private land on a restoration project. And the United States Forest Service, in the form of the Pike National Forest, was kind enough to give us locally obtained seed and seedlings for this project. So. We've been picking away at this for a couple years. We made a couple of significant strides forward. Ed and I have been working on planting and sowing seeds. We feel like we've gotten to the point where we can do this with a reasonable degree of success. So we're developing some capacity to put in these experimental planting and sowing experiments. We've been working on that on our side. Jeff Cannon and Troy Ochiltree have developed or have built and tested and taken apart and rebuilt and retested these environmental sensors, these standalone devices that we can stick out there in the woods that will monitor all these physiologically relevant variables for us. We're at the point where we're sticking trees in the ground in April, so that's coming up. We'll be in several dozen microsites in one stand, so pretty intensive sampling in a small area. The idea is our first pass we'll get a sense of the variability out there and hopefully be able to scale that back a lot and be able to do this in more places. But for starters, we're going big in one stand. Again, our seedlings have contrasting characteristics in terms of shade and drought tolerance, and what we're going to do is monitor germination rates and monitor seedling survival and growth, and then crosswalk that with the microsite scale environmental data. So the next steps after our planting project are analyzing all of this. This is the next major hurdle for us, really getting this data set in hand and trying to work with it. That's kind of intimidating, but ultimately what we need to do is relate these parameters of regeneration success, so germination rates and survival and that sort of thing, to the environmental data, and then relate the environmental data to stand characteristics such as overstory density or small scale topography, soil texture, that kind of stuff, and try to develop that map so that the map can be related to the seedling performance. That's the idea. Once we get that done, we can extend the methodology to additional locations. Lots of really exciting applications for this, right? So as I said before, increasing the efficiency of really large-scale planting projects, exotic species, genetically engineered or improved planting stock, all the kind of stuff that gets a silviculturist excited and makes a lot of people cringe. The potential to downscale climate projections to the microsite scale. So if we can relate what's going on in the microsite to what's going on at the, say, the kilometer scale, then we could have better scope to downscale climate projections to a scale that's relevant for predicting the performance of seedlings across the landscape. Okay. It's good on time. A few takeaways from here. So to summarize, the business of the lab is to address knowledge gaps as they emerge in silviculture. And we focused a lot on regeneration in the last few years. That's really where we went with this. And the reason we've done that is because there are a lot of gaps popping up in regeneration. I mean, that's where a lot of the problems are coming from, so that's where we're focused. We made the conscious decision to do that and orient ourselves in that direction a couple years ago. So that's where we're focused. But we are driven by management need and the problems of the discipline. So we're a silviculture lab in that way. We found it helpful to use both observational and experimental approaches together. That seems to work for us. At this point, after having done both in this area of work for a few years, I don't feel like I should jump off and go one way or the other. I feel like they both contribute things and that they work well together. This set of projects has given me a little bit of perspective, and the way I've framed this is the utility and limitations of silvicultural knowledge. There's a lot of benefits to being able to look at problems from a silvicultural perspective. And the best example I can point at right now is thinking of fuels treatments as shelter woods. And so what got me to that point was thinking of fuels treatments in terms of desired conditions and stand dynamics and stand structure and composition, and oh my God, these are like shelter woods. And that's kind of the thought process that I went through to get there, and I wouldn't have gotten there without the sort of framework and the knowledge base of my discipline to lean back on. And that might sound like a minor terminology issue. Like what you call them fuels treatments, call them shelter woods. It might sound like a small thing, but it's not. It's really not, because by calling them shelter woods, all of a sudden you go from something that is, okay, we have fuels treatments, there's not that many studies on fuels treatment longevity, we don't know that much about fuels treatment longevity, it's really hard to, we can open a textbook and there's a lot of guidance on how to manage a shelter wood. Just thinking about it in a different way, using that context and leaning on that, that big volume of prior work and sort of disciplinary perspective has been really valuable in that sense. I feel like that was a particularly powerful thing. With respect to the microsite project and trying to understand how regeneration is going to develop in a heterogeneous stand, and trying to think about these situations that we don't have any good analogs for. Like, what if we can't regenerate any of our native trees? My discipline is less helpful there. The scale's kind of wrong. We think about things at the stand level, and I think for these particular problems we really need to be thinking smaller scale. And our go-to is using ecological analogs and using experiments in places that are similar as examples and building off of that. And if you get too far removed from what everybody else is doing, then you need a new approach. And so we try to straddle these things, try to be on both sides of this fence, and really honor and draw from the silvicultural knowledge base and that perspective, and really value that and sort of see the power there, while also recognizing that it's our role to push beyond that and do some things that are farther out and are a little more funky. Okay, with that, I hope I didn't talk too long. I'll take any questions if there are.
It seems like a lot of the desired future conditions are focused at either the process or disturbance level. Do you make any assessment of the ecological impacts that the treatments are having?
So I can give you I'll give you a stock answer for that. If the desired future conditions have been characterized well, that should be incorporated in there. So it's possible, the way I was talking about that, I spoke as if those treatments are really, those are the only things in the desired future condition, was, say, resistance to fire, right? If you were to look at a silvicultural prescription, there would likely be several things in there, some of which would be ecological in nature. Having said that, there's people doing bad work some places, right? So that might not always happen.
If you could repeat the question whenever you get it too.
Yes, the question was, desired future conditions ever incorporate ecological aspects? Any other questions?
Yeah, so I'm going to have you speculate a little bit here, but going back to your the sort of fuel reduction treatments on the front range, you didn't see an effect of those treatments, particularly mastication and burning, but it also sounds like the results were really driven by advanced regeneration. So those two treatments really should have been targeting that advanced regeneration. So were they unsuccessful, or why do you think that you didn't get a treatment effect there?
Yeah, so the question was, for the fuels treatment line, the fuels treatment study on the Front Range, we didn't see an effective treatment, but a lot of our juvenile trees were advanced regeneration. So do I think that that was because the treatments didn't effectively deal with the advanced regeneration? Yeah, there's two answers to that. One is that there's a lot of variability in those treatments. So we found that at that scale, we were looking at stuff. We were looking at regeneration. We're on the ground looking at small plots. There's a lot of variability within thinning and burning and those different treatments, and there just might have been too much variability within the treatment types for that to be a useful way to classify those different treatments. The other thing is that it's a weakness of the observational study design in that we didn't have any before data, so we don't know what was in there before the treatment. I mean, those treatments could have nuked a lot of trees, a lot of advanced regeneration, right? Burning, for example, could have killed a lot of advanced regeneration, and there still could have been plenty of advanced regeneration left over, enough to be more than half of what we found, right? So we don't have the approach didn't lend itself to that. Yeah, that did cross my mind as well.
I have a related question. You mentioned fuels hazard treatments are similar to shelter wood, where the goal is to maintain enough overstory to kind of make the conditions better for seedlings to grow. Whereas in a fuels treatment, the goal would be to try to, eliminate a lot of that regeneration from shortening the life of the fuels treatment, getting rid of bladder fuels. But I've heard from managers a lot of times they're reluctant to go beyond like 30% canopy cover because they're afraid they're going to initiate a regeneration event from that. Is that kind of so is stopping at the moderate densities counterproductive to what a fuels treatment needs to do?
So let me make sure I understand. When you say beyond, you mean less than 30% or greater than 30%? Less than 30%. So the question was, let me see if I can paraphrase that. The question was that hazardous fuel reduction treatments, you don't want a lot of little trees in there, right? And shelter woods you do, and the management community is reluctant to open stands up more than they already are because they're afraid of getting too much regeneration. Fair so far? Yeah. And then, so what would my recommendation be? Yeah, my recommendation would be to they're getting regeneration. Whether or not it's turns into something that's a problem is not as clear, but they are getting regeneration. I guess broadly in agreement with the management community about the level, about the openness. I guess my perspective on that is less about the actual amount of regeneration or the amount of overstory that's left in terms of its influence on the regeneration, as in viewing that through the lens of a shelter wood, understanding that the overstory is a critical aspect of what you're going to get in terms of regeneration, and thinking about that explicitly in terms of the sylvics of the species that you're dealing with. And so, making some statements through the process of developing a prescription that says, this is my expectation of what's going to happen in terms of regeneration following this fuels treatment based on the overstory density that I'm leaving and the sylvics of the tree species and the composition of the overstory. So it's really more about thinking about that. You may end up doing the same thing. The treatments might actually look the same. You would just have a much better understanding of what's going to happen down the road. You may still choose to do the same thing.
We have time for one or two more questions.
One of you.
No, I'll let you do it.
Okay, well, I was just curious in the spatially heterogeneous fuel treatments, I was curious if in the areas that are really like the big openings, if there's much advanced regeneration there, because I wouldn't think that they're like do a better job at getting those juveniles, but I was curious from your observation so far if there is a lot less advanced regeneration And then if so, if it seems like there's much new seedling establishment.
Yeah. So, and somebody else may have a better answer for this who's sampled those in a different way. We didn't do a systematic sample of heterogeneous restoration treatments, so I don't really have a lot of perspective on what's in those openings. The one that we're installing this treatment in, there doesn't seem to be very much out there. And by doing the experiment in those openings, we'll have a sense of what could be out there with a seed source. Mike, did you have one? Or?
Well, I just wanted to ask you about your labs, because silviculture is such an applied field. How do you work with translating the data that you're getting? You know, you publish it in the scientific community, but also translating it to the land managers so that they can do that adaptive management.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and there's, like, I guess I'd say 4 different things that we do. One is that some of these projects are in operational treatments, right? So I mean, the translation involves, you know, kicking dirt with the forester in the field, you know, out there with a hard hat on and talking about what's happening with the project, and you know, for the purposes of that specific project, it's, you know, direct translation to management. We teach, I teach, and so there's that, which is just kind of an easy one to say there. There's been a lot of strength from working with CFRI, Colorado Forest Restoration Institute. It's been, I found it beneficial to take advantage of working with that organization. It really helps get the work that we're doing to the people that need it. And then we do some continuing education, and I'm part of a group of faculty at 4 universities in the West, so with people at Utah State, Northern Arizona, and University of Idaho, and we teach a reforestation course to mid-career silviculturists in the federal government every other year, and you know, it's built around this stuff, right? I mean, among other things, but yeah, it's a lot of it's direct communication to the people who are designing prescriptions, honestly.
Okay, let's give another round of applause for Seth.